Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. It sure sounds like Tim Connelly is staying in Minnesota for the foreseeable future. We'll talk about his postseason comments. Plus, we'll start player reviews today. Let's talk two-way players, end of the roster guys. What kind of years did they have? It's all coming next.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Tons to get to today. I want to talk about Tim Connelly's comments and effectively his season-ending exit interview with the media. We'll talk about his future with the team, everything else he addressed in his media availability, a couple things that stood out to me related to the current roster, the upcoming offseason, etc. And then I want to spend some time diving into player reviews from the season. We'll do two-way guys today, the three players that ended the season on two-way contracts with the Wolves, as well as the other guys kind of 13 through 15 on the roster, what kind of years they had, if any of them might be back. Well, some of them will be back, but some of them won't be. So we'll talk about that and what they brought to the table or maybe didn't bring to the table in 24-25. So all that is coming up today. A big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right. So the players and Chris Finch did their season exit interviews effectively last week, Thursday. Basically, here's how the year's closed out. Like, here's what we're going to talk about. Anthony Edwards, of course, did not participate, was not present, but the majority of the rest of the roster did. Lots of Julius Randle comments about how much he loved Minnesota. Great Nas Reid comments. Good stuff from Chris Finch last week. We talked a little bit about it on Friday's show. Today, I want to talk about Monday's Tim Connelly press conference that he gave and some of the things he commented on. The headline, of course, is Tim Connelly said he was asked about if he'd be staying in Minnesota. Of course, last summer, Tim Connelly had an opt-out that he kicked forward to this summer because of the ever-evolving and still, ongoing, never seemingly resolved completely ownership situation, which is just needs to be finalized later in the month of June, but is all but wrapped up at this point. Because of the uncertainty, he kicked his opt-out forward to this summer, and of course the assumption for why he did that is the reason he was brought on, albeit while Glenn Taylor was still the majority owner, but why he was brought on a few years ago was because Mark Lori and Alex Rodriguez, the new minority owners at the time, pushed for Tim Connelly to come to Minnesota, and they gave him essentially a record type contract in terms of the financials as well as future ownership possibilities and all that stuff to try and get Tim Connelly to Minnesota. And so it would make sense that he would want to keep working for Lori and Rodriguez and their group and not for Glenn Taylor. So this was never, of course, said publicly, but the assumption was he kicked the opt-out forward just in case Glenn Taylor won the arbitration case that just was resolved here in the last few months. And then he could choose to opt out. And then also there's the possibility of, could he opt out anyway to just, restructure the deal, get more money, more years, more security, etc. And of course he still could, but the fact that he was comfortable enough to make the comments he did in Monday's press conference means he's got a really good working relationship with the new ownership group. When he was asked about if he intends to stay in Minnesota or not, he said it feels like home. And then part of the rest of his answer was, I think you guys are stuck with me. So, if you're trying to leverage that opt-out to gain more years, more money, etc., you're probably not going to say that in a presser. So there's clearly mutual respect, obviously mutual respect, but the understanding that like they trust one another, mutual trust, I guess is the better way to say it, that Connelly and the Lori Rodriguez ownership group trust each other, and Connelly knows they're going to do right by him. They're going to bring him there. They will extend him, whether or not he has to formally opt out or not, I'm not sure, but I don't think they need to be negotiating through the media. Clearly Tim Connelly doesn't think he has to. And that is a really good sign. Obviously, the actual comments that he is planning to be back and be in Minnesota for the foreseeable future, but also the fact that he's comfortable to make those comments speaks to the relationship he has with the new group. And of course, this has been reported before. I kind of figured it was almost a done deal as soon as the ownership stuff got ironed out. But there's been tons of other national reporters that have kind of said, it sounds like he'll be here. There's, of course, been the stories that I refuse to give oxygen to on this show about the Hawks and of course, the Nuggets after just prior to the end of the regular season, dismissing Calvin Booth and, of course, also Michael Malone. But would there be the possibility the Crunkies come after Tim Connelly, the Crunkies being the Denver owners, to get Connelly back to Denver? We know that Connelly had a tough time leaving Denver. Basically, when he came to Minnesota, it was kind of like, this is too good. The offer was too good to refuse, sort of a thing. Was a little apprehensive about moving his young family, all that stuff. Clearly, they've really loved their time in Minnesota to this point and don't intend to leave anytime soon. So that's the headline here. Nothing else that's like groundbreaking, earth-shattering, because there's only so much you can say as the president of basketball operations in a postseason press conference. But when he was asked about the Julius Randle, Naz Reid, Alexander Walker free agencies, of course, Alexander Walker being the only unrestricted free agent, both Naz and Julius Randle holding player options. We talked pretty extensively about this on Friday's show and a little bit more on Monday's show. Connelly sure sounded like somebody who was hoping to bring back all three of them. I say that he basically did say those words. And I think he used the phrase cautiously optimistic about bringing all three of them back, which is challenging, but he also admitted, or I should say, suggested that they'd be willing to dip their toe into the second apron, which of course they're below now. But if you bring them all back, you assume you're going to be there. And he basically said, you don't want to live there because it's restrictive. Remember, it's prohibitive in terms of you can't aggregate salaries to trade. Basically, you can't do 2-for-1 trades. You can't, there's a lot of things you can't do if you're over the second apron, but you can get over it and then get back. Right. And that is essentially what he's saying, that alluding to the possibility of doing that in order to keep those guys. And he says, look, they want to be here. He actually did say, most importantly, they want to be here in Minnesota. And they all basically said that more or less in their exit interviews last week. But to be reiterated from Tim Connelly is great. And again, that speaks to trust. It speaks to a relationship that, like, they're not negotiating through the media. They're not trying to be too careful tiptoeing around their words, because everyone knows, like, the Wolves want to do right by those guys. Those guys want to get paid. And of course, they'd like to be in Minnesota. They want to do right by the organization, especially in the case of Naz and to a lesser extent, Nikhil, who got his big kind of breakthrough opportunity growth in Minnesota. But Naz, his whole everything has taken place in Minnesota. So these guys want to be with the Wolves. The Wolves want them back. They also know these guys want to get paid. And could Naz go somewhere else and become a starter and make more money? Yeah, maybe not this year because nobody has cap space. But that would be a reason why he could opt in and not sign an extension. Of course, there's risk involved for Naz Reid there too, right? What if the worst happens and he opts in and he gets hurt? He becomes a free agent next year, say it's a serious injury. Does he ever get the deal he wants, or that he deserves, really? He could opt in and extend with Minnesota. That's maybe the most realistic or most likely scenario. Or he could opt out and just hope that he gets a lot of money from Brooklyn, or somebody else is able to somehow create space to sign him for more than he'd get in Minnesota. Or is it just a playing time thing? And he's obviously played more each of the last 2 years in Minnesota. And depending on what happens to Julius Randle, like say Julius Randle moves on, Naz could resign, could opt in, sign an extension, and be a starter in Minnesota. Like, all these things are on the table for Naz Reid. And he's probably, I think, the most fascinating case because of that. He could be, maybe I think I said this on Friday. I still think maybe the most realistic scenario is Naz opts in and signs an extension. Randle opts in, does not sign an extension, and then eventually Randle's traded if it's later in the summer or at the deadline next year if there needs to be an in-season shakeup. And Naz knows this all along, that he'll go into the year as a sixth man again, but ultimately could be a starter once Randle's moved. I think that's entirely possible. But all that to say, Tim Connelly spoke to the real possibility of keeping all those guys. He talked, of course, glowingly about Chris Finch, as he always does. He talked glowingly about the coaching staff, including Mike Nori, who we know has interviewed for Phoenix and maybe some other head coaching jobs as well. And then also some stuff about Anthony Edwards that you'd expect, where he basically said, we go as Ant goes, and we think he's going to be one of the best players ever. And nothing else like terribly groundbreaking. Oh, he did talk a little bit about young players on the roster and the possibility of using draft picks. And I've said on the show already a couple of times, I don't think the Wolves pick at 17 and 31 and keep both guys. I think at least one of those picks is kicked forward to a future draft. But Connelly said whoever we pick at those spots isn't necessarily either. We're not going to rely on them to play because we've got young guys already in our gym that are going to be a step ahead of anybody we draft this year. And of course, that could be, we'll talk about Leonard Miller on today's show. Josh Minott would still fall under that category. And then last year's rookies, whether it's Terrence Shannon Jr. or Rob Dillingham, Jalen Clark would fall. And that's 5 guys right there that would all fit the bill of young players who haven't cracked into the rotation, who could be rotation guys in Minnesota or elsewhere. But because the Wolves are really good, they haven't gotten that real solid opportunity with Minnesota. And that's a good thing. That's a good problem to have. He also said, and this is a bit of gamesmanship maybe isn't the right word. But he said they view 17 and 31 as very similar in terms of value in this year's draft, or basically the same, I think is maybe the phrase he used, something like that, which is of course a little silly, but it also speaks to the depth of this draft. And also that's him continuing to set up the possibility of like, we could trade one, we could trade both, we could trade neither. If what I said on Friday's show was if somebody the Wolves like is there at 17, they'll pick there and they'll trade 31 for a future first. I think they could do that. If they don't like somebody at 17, they could trade it for maybe a more lightly protected future first and then pick at 31 if there's a bunch of guys they do like. So a lot of possibilities there. All right, I want to do player reviews. We'll kind of set up how I'm going to do the whole thing here in a minute, and we'll hit, I guess we're really going to hit 6 guys today because they're guys that didn't play a whole lot, but I think it's important to at least wrap our minds around what kind of seasons they each had on the Wolves roster. So we're going to do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at OpenPhone. If you're running a business, you know that every missed call is money left on the table. Think about the last time that you had an urgent need. Maybe it was for a plumber or service provider of some kind. If the first person didn't answer, did you wait? Probably not. You moved on to whatever's next on the list, and that's why you need OpenPhone. OpenPhone is the #1 business phone system built to streamline and scale your customer communications, all from an app on your phone or computer. OpenPhone will let you manage business calls and texts from a single app. The shared inbox feature is a game changer. Your team can jump into any conversation instantly without missing a beat. Plus, their AI agent handles after-hours calls, answers common questions, and captures leads, all so that you never miss a customer. OpenPhone is offering my listeners 20% off your first 6 months at openphone.com/lockdownnba. That's OpenPhone, OpenPhone.com/lockdownnba. If you have existing numbers with other service, OpenPhone will port them over at no extra charge. OpenPhone, no missed calls, no missed customers. All right, so something I've been doing the last several years here at Locked On Wolves is player reviews after the season. We are daily every day throughout June and July, which of course the draft and free agency and potential trades is going to take up a ton of that time. So now is actually the perfect time of year to take a half step back and look at who is on the roster currently, what kind of seasons everybody had, and both like reviewing what they did this year and what that might mean for an outlook for next year. As we get into like August and into early September, we'll do player previews for the season. Obviously the roster will be built out at that point. We thought that last year, and then the town straight happened. But now is a good time to look at the context of the season. What did we expect to happen that did or did not happen? So what I typically do is I'll go from two-way contracts, and then we'll do those guys first, which this year, those were the guys that played the least. I'm not going to talk about guys that aren't on the team anymore, like PJ Dozier and Daishen Nix, of course, started the year on the team, worked on the team at the end. We'll talk about the two-way guys that finished the year on two-way contracts. And then I'm going to essentially sort the roster by minutes played and go from the bottom up. Today, we're going to hit 3 two-way guys and then the 3 guys that played the least. And then once we get into the top 12, so like Josh Minott is the 12th guy, that'll likely be Wednesday's show. And there's a bit of fluidity here just in case any news breaks, anything significant we got to talk about to interrupt the series. But we'll do like basically a segment on every guy from 12 up. And as we get to the starters, we'll do like half shows or maybe even a full show on like Ant and some of those guys to really dig into their respective seasons and see where they improved and where maybe they didn't improve. So, but today these guys didn't play a whole lot, so it's easy to go quickly, but I think it's important to understand how the entire roster is built out. And I think it's kind of fun to dig in on some of these. So we can start with the two-way guys. And of course, at the start of the season, Jalen Clark was one of those because he signed the 2-year two-way deal after being a second-round pick following the Achilles tear at UCLA a couple of years ago. And then he was promoted to a full NBA contract, similar to what happened last season with Luca Garza. And the Timberwolves signed Bones Highland to a two-way deal. Of course, Highland, a former pick of Tim Connelly with the Denver Nuggets. Bones was a rumored trade target for Connelly, both in Denver and then when he was at the Clippers. And then LA actually waived him earlier this season, and Minnesota picked him up. So we could start with the one guy who actually started the year on a two-way deal was Jesse Edwards. A reminder on Edwards, he he still is like a 7'2", big center. In terms of like big man archetypes, I would lump him into the same category as a Rudy Gobert. Obviously, he's not Rudy Gobert. I feel like I need to say those words. Maybe I shouldn't need to, but I did. That type of big, though, right, where he's essentially a roll big, a rim protecting big, traditional in terms of size. He's not a stretch guy. He shot a little bit from outside the arc at West Virginia at the end of college. He played 5 years of college at Syracuse in West Virginia. And he's a defense first big who has okay, not great hands, okay, not great athleticism, pretty good shot blocking instincts. That's kind of what his job, or what his I guess, I don't know, archetype, I think, is a pretty good way to say it. But like basically his profile as a player is that. He only got into 2 games at the NBA level for Minnesota. He played 5 total minutes in the regular season. And like there's obviously nothing to go off of there. But we can look at what he did in the G League and speak to that a little bit. Of course, as a two-way guy, he's a restricted free agent for next year. The Wolves can bring him back. In the regular season in the G League, he averaged 12 and 8. He shot 61% from the floor. He averaged more than 2 blocks per game. The block rate of was 7.9%, which is really nice. The rebound rate was okay, 18%. You'd like that to be a little bit higher. And again, this is just regular season play. There's also the tip-off tournament stuff where he was even better there in the G League, which is like another dozen or so games that they played outside of the regular season. And the per-game averages otherwise were about the same. So pretty much what you'd expect. He's already 24. I believe he turns 25 here pretty quickly. So there's only so much you can really get out of Jesse Edwards. I thought it made sense to have him on the roster as, on some level, Gobert insurance. I mean, if Gobert had gotten hurt, like they would have done something besides just play Jesse Edwards, but at least he would be that big that could profile that way. And of course, they also were able to have him then in training camp, use him on, scout teams and stuff like that if they wanted to. So not a real prospect necessarily, but somebody they could bring back if they saw something there and wanted to have another big on a two-way deal. But there just isn't much else to say about Jesse Edwards in terms of what the Wolves were expecting or what they got out of him this year. But that's his profile as a player, if you missed that toward the beginning of the season. Tristan Newton's a bit more interesting. Remember, he was claimed off waivers from Indiana during the season. I think he was on a two-way deal with Indiana, was waived, and then Minnesota picked him up. He played in 5 games for the Pacers earlier this season. Last year, he played in 8 games across a couple of different NBA teams. So total through this was his rookie season. So 8 total games was this year. He played 5 with the Pacers, 3 with Minnesota. And he was a second-round pick just last year by the Pacers. So a second-round pick in last year's draft by the Pacers and was ultimately waived. He played 3 seasons at Eastern Carolina and then 2 seasons at UConn. The profile for Tristan Newton really is as more of a kind of defense-first combo guard type player. Size-wise, like he's not a point guard really. He's really more of a shooting guard, but I think he's got a bit more of that passing ability. The assist rate has been solid. If you look at the collegiate stuff and what he's done in the G League in relatively limited opportunity, there is some upside there for him to initiate some offense from the 2-guard spot. The Wolves obviously really like his upside. Total this year in the G League, which was mostly with Iowa, he averaged 16 points, 7 assists, and 6 rebounds. The shooting isn't great. He shot just 31% from outside the arc in regular play in the regular season. He did play in the tip-off tournament with the Pacers and shot 41% across 10 games there. That's a bit of a smaller sample. But again, the combo guard skill set is what's intriguing. The athleticism, the pretty good size of 6'5" with a good wingspan. Again, nothing really to say about that at the NBA level. They like his upside, but again, it's a 5-year college player who's 24, and the Wolves have several guys ahead of him that are the same age or younger. Obviously, TJ Shannon was also a 5-year college player, but Rob Dillingham was a 1-year or one and done guy at Kentucky, right? So what's the upside for Tristan Newton? It's relatively limited. I think he could be a plug and play. You're down a couple guys due to injury, illness, whatever. I think there's still some opportunity there for him to play. I'd be intrigued for him to be back next year on a 2-way deal, and it wouldn't shock me if of the 3 2-way guys, Tristan Newton is the one that they were able to bring back they were encouraged to bring back. I think there could be something still there that's of interest. The last one is Bones Highland. We talked a bit about him when the Wolves brought him in. I guess that was in March. Bones is Bones, right? Like he's a high volume scorer who's never been as good of a shooter or consistent of a shooter as he probably should be. The shot selection is dicey, but he can get hot and then just can't miss. For his career, he's only about league average from outside the arc, but he's had a couple seasons where he's 37, 38%, a shade above league average in those years. And, back when he was playing regularly for the Nuggets, he was 10, 12 points per game, 3 assists per game. Again, just a little above league average from outside the arc. The thought process behind bringing him in, obviously Tim Connelly likes his presence with the team because he's drafted him and tried to get him a couple of different times. And there was no, other than doing Bones a solid here, there was no reason to bring him in. He wasn't playoff eligible when they signed him to a 2-way deal. It was, at the time I said, it was really more of a, hey, if somebody gets hurt or something weird happens and we just need to win a game that maybe we shouldn't win, let's put Bones in the game and see what happens. He can get hot and drop 20 plus. He did that for the Clippers earlier in the season in a random game. This is something Bones Highland can still do. And he only played garbage time across 4 games for Minnesota. He's still young in terms of how long he's been in the league. He doesn't turn 25 until September. So could he still find an NBA role? I think it's possible. I'd be surprised if it was with Minnesota. Maybe it's like what they did with Daishen Nix last year, which is you sign him to a 2-way deal, and then when something better comes along, like the Wolves did when they found Tristan Newton this fall, you let him go and you find your next guy. So there's a possibility that that Bones is back next year. It's just there's no real role for Bones Highland. I don't think he's a true backup point guard at the NBA level. He is an undersized shooting guard that can be, catch lightning in a bottle, and that's kind of it for Bones Highland. So pretty limited G League. There's been years where the Wolves have needed, or I shouldn't say G League, 2-way guy need for the Wolves this year. There have been years where the Wolves have needed their 2-way guys to contribute more, and that wasn't necessary this season, which is a really good thing. It speaks to how good the team was, of course, and how deep the rotation was as well. All right. Let's close by talking about the, 13th through 15th guys in terms of minutes played for Minnesota this year. So 3 guys to close out here on the show today as we look at their seasons in review that's upcoming here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is sponsored by BetterHelp. Let's talk about something that doesn't get talked about enough, and that is men's mental health. There's a pressure to always keep it together, to perform, provide, never show weakness. But the truth is, real strength comes from opening up and taking care of your mental well-being. Every year, 6 million men in the U.S. experience depression, and many go undiagnosed. But talking to someone, a friend, a loved one, or a therapist can make a huge difference. And look, therapy isn't just for crisis moments. It's something to kind of help upkeep your consistent health, right? It's not just like when you are in a crisis. It can help you learn how to set boundaries. Maybe it's build healthy coping tools and simply be the best version of yourself. BetterHelp has over 35,000 licensed professionals, and they can make it easy to find a therapist who understands you. You can connect from anywhere, switch therapists at any time, and fit sessions into your schedule with just a click. As the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of experience. Talk it out with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/LockedOnNBA. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Okay, so the non-2-way guys that played the least for this year's Timberwolves that finished the year on the roster are, in order from least to most minutes, Leonard Miller, played 32 minutes across 13 games. Joe Ingles, who played 114 minutes over 19 games, and Luca Garza, who played 219 minutes over 39 games. Let's start with Leonard Miller. I'm still pretty intrigued by Leonard Miller as a professional basketball player, and the Wolves still have him. Let's see, the exact contract situation is he's still under contract for this year. He's got a guaranteed it's partially guaranteed. He's under contract for $2.2 million. Half of that is guaranteed. So the Wolves could waive him and only owe him half of his salary. But I don't think that does anybody any good. I think that they've got until June 30th before the rest of the contract becomes guaranteed. If there's a draft night trade, if they need to save themselves $1 million, they're up against the second apron, whatever. If they need a roster spot, you could waive him. That is an option. He's the only guy that has a partially guaranteed deal, right? So Randle and Reid have player options. Garza might not have team options that are full team options with no guaranteed money. Leonard Miller's half guaranteed. So they would waive him before anybody else. That's not Luca Garza or Josh Minott, who wouldn't be waived, but they just wouldn't have their options picked up. I would be genuinely surprised if they let Leonard Miller go. He still has upside. He's still only going to be 22 this next year. I don't even think he's 22 yet. There's still a lot there to like as a point forward and athlete. Now, the behind the scenes stuff, like that's all the team sees, all that stuff. They know the work ethic. They know the locker room personality. I know there were some maturity concerns. Remember, he didn't go to school. He went to the G League for a year. Now that he's been a NBA pro for the last couple of years in an NBA organization, hopefully some of that stuff has been, improved. Certainly he could be thrown into a trade. If the Wolves need to free up a roster spot, if they're below the second apron, they can still aggregate contracts and send out more guys than they take back. That's a real possibility. I bet he has some trade value because there is so much upside. Like, pick any rebuilding team, like a Washington or Portland or something. Portland's maybe in a little bit of a better spot. They certainly are in a better spot than Washington. Pick any non-playoff team or non even play-in team, and they would love the Leonard Miller upside. I mean, he has lottery talent. The question is, can he put it all together? Is the head on straight in order to put it all together as a pro? I still like the potential. Not much to say about what he did this season, because again, he played 32 minutes of regular season basketball. I mean, he played like a quarter of that just in the final playoff blowout. It was crazy. I mean, we could talk about his G League stuff. I think it's kind of been more of the same, where you'd like to see a little bit more consistency than what he's shown, like shooting wise, for instance. His first year at the Iowa Wolves, so last year, he was like 36, 37%. This year that went down a little bit, 34, 35% range. The scoring was up a bit. He was a little bit better in the paint. We also saw but the rebounding, the assist rate, all that stuff kind of stagnated. There was some progress defensively. The block rate and the steal rate were both up. I think he was more active from everything I saw of him in the G League, which, transparently, I didn't watch every G League game from Leonard Miller, but from what I watched and from what I read about Leonard Miller and his role in the G League, is he just seemed a bit more locked in on the defensive side, a bit more active. And that's positive. There's just not a rotation spot for him next year. I thought at the start of this season, there'd be a chance that he would, find his way into a 10th, 11th man role, depending on how things shook out, but that was never really a thing. At the moment, he's maybe some sort of insurance. If somehow both Nas and Randle leave, okay, you don't go into the season as a conference finals team the last 2 years and then be like, all right, Leonard Miller's our guy now. But he's been in the system. They know him. They know what he can do. So as a bit of insurance on a very affordable contract, he's still on the roster, and there is still real upside. Again, age-wise, he turns 23. Is that right? Or sorry, he turns 22 in November. The week of Thanksgiving is when he turns 22. So he's still painfully young. Basically would be going into his senior year in college is how old he is. And he was 33rd overall pick a couple of years ago. So nearly a first round pick in terms of value as well. So there's still upside there. I think he's still around next year, and I'm curious to see where the Wolves go with him. Joe Ingles, I don't have much to say about Joe. If you had told me before the year he only would make 3 3-pointers this season, I would have been absolutely floored. I thought he would have a rotation role, and he did for all of, 5 games? 5 games. He was in the rotation, played between 4 and 7 minutes in each of the Wolves' first 5 games. And then he was out of the rotation, did not play rotation minutes at all the rest of the season, except for when there were a couple games, there were a lot of injuries. He had like 4 games. He came in as an inbounder at the very end of the game. He had a couple games. He came in as a zone buster. There was the loss in Washington where he had to play 19 minutes because like Randle was out and Ant was out and there was nobody. And he scored 10 points, was a plus 11 in 19 minutes and actually played pretty well. That was kind of his best game of the season by far. And then he didn't make a shot. Like, he played in Milwaukee in mid-February, and then he played 1, 2, 3, 4. He played parts of 4 games after that, did not make a shot. A bit of an unceremonious end. If this is the end of Joe Ingles' NBA career and he heads into coaching or perhaps playing overseas, I don't know, probably not at this point, but I was disappointed that he didn't get, like, he looked pretty cooked over those first 5 games, but he was still a decent rotation player for Orlando last year and hit threes at almost a 44% clip at 17 minutes a game. So I was a bit surprised he didn't get another opportunity at some point, but this is going to be about it for Joe Ingles. Obviously he was a big locker room part of this year's team, but just never worked out in terms of his any sort of potential as a rotation piece. Luca Garza didn't actually get as many rotation minutes as he did a year ago. Gobert missed a month, Julius Randle missed a month, and that led to Luca playing for a bit. He had a couple of really good games mixed in there, and then there was a period of time where he really struggled. And Luca Garza is very matchup dependent. I've said this before about him. He is still a very skilled offensive big man. He can knock down threes. He's great in the post. He's also still very limited defensively. And if he gets the wrong matchup when he's on offense, the wrong defensive matchup, he also can be stymied in the post. And if he's not hitting open threes, it hurts because teams will leave him open. So like there was the loss to the Jazz this year where he played 17 minutes and he was 4 of 4 on twos, got to the line 9 times, scored 16 points, like was pretty valuable. And then he had games like there was another, he had an 0 of 6 in that loss to Washington. I mentioned Ingles had a big game. Garza played 11 minutes, went 0 of 6, missed all 3 of his threes, only had 2 rebounds in 11 minutes, like just didn't provide much. So very matchup dependent. I mentioned earlier his contract situation is the Timberwolves have a team option for him. I would expect him to be back again as big man depth, but again, maybe the roster spot is more valuable. Maybe they, choose to not bring him back. The option has to be decided by June 29th is the club option, according to Spot Track. Him and Josh Minott both have club options on that day. So they could always choose to not bring him back and then re-sign him later in the offseason if they end up not needing the roster spot. There's a couple different options there. I would expect him to be back at essentially a vet minimum, $2.3 million. You need big man depth. They know Luca. Luca knows them. There's a real possibility he comes back. Just he is what he is, right? Luca Garza is what Luca Garza is. And that's a solid depth big, a good work ethic guy, a good practice guy. Can step in and win you a game if the matchup is right. Like legitimately, he can look like a rotation big against the right matchup. But against a team that plays fast, that has skilled athletic bigs, guys that can eat him up in pick and roll coverage when he's on defense, he doesn't look playable. So it really just depends on the night and the matchup. And if the Wolves have injuries and stuff line up with matchups that work for Luca Garza, then it's a steal to have him on the roster at $2.4 million. All right. That's all I got for you today. We got to wrap up today's show. We'll continue player reviews on Wednesday. We'll get into, I'll spend basically a full segment on each of the next few guys. We'll get into Josh Minott, who I always love talking about, TJ Shannon, and Rob Dillingham. So 3 really intriguing ones. I actually may do more than a segment on each of these. I may split them up a bit more over the rest of the week because I think this is where a lot of the meat of the off-season conversation is can these guys crack the rotation and what's next for each of their careers? And they're all in kind of different spots, Minott, Shannon, and Dillingham, in my opinion. So we'll talk about all that here later in the week on the show. Big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen. Of course, you can listen anywhere. You can watch on YouTube. You can watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app, on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And a reminder that for your second listen, you can check out the Locked On NBA Big Board Show, where Rafael Barlow will react to every workout, interview, and rumor leading up to the draft. Find the Locked On NBA Big Board Show on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Of course, Locked On Wolves is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.